been brought forward to them. And so we're going to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes having this conversation. If it goes beyond that time, we will carry it over to another Wednesday work session. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time to give this its due diligence and make sure that we have plenty of conversation on the matter. So I apologize for my backdrop as I'm using a different computer and don't have the wonderful wood paneling backdrop that you all have. So with all that being said, I will turn it over to the gentleman at the police station. Good evening.
Good evening. So this is Chief Brett Smith here. I also have with me Lieutenant George Tro and Lieutenant Jose Gonzalez. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and start here. And Melissa, if you would go ahead and put up for their viewing opportunity, the 75 things white people can do for racial justice, that'd be great. And I'm going to go ahead and start. So since the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there have been a couple documents being circulated about how to achieve racial justice. They include the 75 things white people can do for racial justice. Two of those recommendations at the top have to do with outfitting all officers with a body-worn camera. And you'll see that under number one. There's actually, again, 75 things, but these are two of the predominant ones at the very top of the list. And that list is actually growing. It was 75, and now it continues to be additional ideas that are being added to that. The second one on that is that the department does evidence-based police de-escalation trainings. And so those are the two. Another document is titled #8Can'tWait. And the message being that research shows that more restrictive use of force policies can reduce killings by police and save lives. And the 8 recommendations include the ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require warning before shooting, requires a police officer to exhaust all alternatives before shooting, requires a duty for police officers to intervene, ban shooting at moving vehicles, require the use of force continuum, and require comprehensive reporting. Just recently, Oregon Governor Kate Brown established a joint committee on transparent policing and use of force reform. As a result, 6 measures just became law and are just the start in what will prove to be a much larger and longer conversation with more significant implications to law enforcement as we know today, especially here in Oregon. Future subjects of conversations will include qualified immunity, civilian oversight of law enforcement, Department of Public Safety standards and training in respect to training and certifications, use of force standards, and the militarization of police. And Melissa, if you would move on to the next piece, it's titled 6 Police Accountability Legislative Bills. So there are going to be many changes in Oregon police policies and training, and even some of the Canby Police Department policies have already been updated since you received them, but you've had those emailed to you. What is important to know is that the 6 police accountability legislative bills were all created under an emergency clause, meaning that they became law as soon as they are signed by the governor. These 6 legislative bills are currently in effect now, and they're listed there, and I'll just briefly go over them, but you have that so you can look at it. Senate Bill 1604, it's an arbitration reform. Basically, it restricts and imposes some limitations on an arbitrator to change a decision that has been given by a police department unless it meets certain conditions. House Bill 4201 establishes a joint committee on transparent policing and use of police form. It's a committee that's going to examine policies related to use of force and other types of things, trying to build transparency into the system. And it will look at policies, make recommendations to the Legislative Assembly. That committee is supposed to be done and be ready to work by December 31st of this year. House Bill 4203 is a police chokehold ban. Basically, officers are not allowed to use force that impede normal breathing or circulation of blood. or another person by applying pressure on the throat or neck unless there's a deadly force, physical force justification. House Bill 4205, this bill requires that police officers have a duty to intervene and report misconduct. And House Bill 4207, this bill directs the Department of Public Standards and Safety to establish a public statewide online database that reports suspensions and revocations and certifications of officers who fail to meet the established minimum standards. And down there, I put a few of those types of standards that you can look at that could be included, and there's going to be other ones as well. But those are the main catch-all that I think that you can take a look at. Again, this bill also addresses hiring requirements. There's be changes in that in respect to how we request, review, and provide personnel records. And also the retention of personnel records will be maintained by that city or agency for 10 years after that person leaves the agency, not retires, but leaves the agency. So they will have a requirement there. And the last one that just went into effect is House Bill 4208. This bill prohibits law enforcement agencies from using tear gas or long-range acoustic devices or sound cannons for purposes of crowd control unless it fits the definition of riot. We don't have too much of a concern that here, but it is one of the ones that was recently passed. So my intended purpose for calling our work session here today, and I thank you so much for being able to be here, is inform you of the most recent and future legislative changes, especially in light of the death of George Floyd and the demand for police reform. Since the death of George Floyd, these conversations have been ongoing daily for that matter, and they are very significant. I think it's important for you to know what is taking place, and just as important, I want you to have confidence in the city's police department in respect to these changes. So what I want to do is we'll jump to, if we can, Melissa, would you go ahead and put up the Canby Police Department General Orders document? And so what I wanted to start in all incidences with the exception of those legislative bills that are being sent to committees for additional work. The hashtag 8 can't wait recommendations in the Oregon legislative bills are covered. These are covered in the Canby Police Department's policy and procedures. While not all recommendations are accepted at this time, most of the 8 can't wait recommendations or those in the 75 things white people can do for racial justice are already in effect, and modifications have been made to those policies where they are needed to keep current with any of the new state mandates. So what I thought I would do is start with the first one. And the reason why I sent you all the policies for your opportunity to look at is looking at House Bill 4205, duty to intervene. If we go to general order, the very first one we have under 1.00, general rules and regulations, we have that policy addresses a lot of officer conduct related issues. But most specifically under item number 51, we already had in our policy, we've updated it to meet some of the reporting timeline requirements, but I highlighted it all in red. That duty to report misconduct or use of force is in our policy. It's been there. We've modified it, but I've also sent you some other things. This isn't just a policy. This is a cultural. This is a belief within our department that is very important to us. If you look at Standing in the Gap memo that's dated September 26, 2017, and or the memorandum that every new officer is given talking about expectations that we don't let our fellow officers fail because they're doing something they shouldn't be or they need assistance, we have an obligation to stand in the gap, so to speak, and do something about that and report it. Those have been given and have been a part of our culture here in our organization for a while. Also 1.01 ethics and standards, as you look at our code of ethics, oath of office, mission statement, organizational values, or vision statement, all have some reflection of our duty to uphold an ethical standard and report misconduct. And that has been a priority for us. And I want to let you guys see that it's in there, but we've also updated it to reflect the current changes because, as I mentioned, that's one of the ones that just was recently passed under the emergency clause. If we go down to, and that obviously has been addressed in the hashtag 8 can't wait. If we go down to the de-escalation requirement, we have Our GO's 3.12 training addresses de-escalation. It's highlighted in red. The 5.01 use of force de-escalation there, it talks about deadly force and reasonableness of use of force. It also addresses, as mentioned in the hashtag #8can'twait, the levels of force or the force continuum. Those are in there as well. They've been in our policy prior. We look at those as a guide for our officers as they approach these situations. And we also address, when we talk about de-escalation, we also have that as part of our training in our policy, but 5.02, the use of force instrumentality, but it's the use of less lethal weapons as well. All of those are pieces that go to an attempt to de-escalate and are part of our training, and they're part of our policies and procedures in more than one particular area of our department. So I wanted to share that with you as well. That also addresses some of the recommendations that are out there. The House Bill 4203, police chokehold ban, that also has been addressed in the hashtag #8can'twait. We have that already addressed. It's been addressed under 5.02. It also addresses carotid restraints and shooting at or from moving vehicles. Those have all been in our policy. Those are something we do not train as it relates to carotid. And our standard for that is a deadly force standard. And so that is the same that's been passed in the emergency bill that just went down, and we're consistent with that as well. So I wanted to share those. If we go to require comprehensive reporting, we have a lot of reporting requirements. Those are one of the ones that are mentioned in the hashtag #8can'twait. And we have reporting requirements that do with bias crimes. I wanted to give you an update on the latest bias crime changes. Those are new as well as it relates to some of the definitions and what's included. Some of the new definitions are disability is one of them. I'm just trying to think of all of them off the top of my head there, but you have those highlighted there. And then there's also bias crimes that we think are actually a crime, and we have bias incidents that not meet that criteria. We have a mandate to report those now and also refer to people to a hotline for assistance, even if we don't have a crime. And so we're going through that process of changing that, and that's new. So we have a lot of, again, reporting requirements. And if you look at 3.01, the complaint review GO, we have things in there that talk about the state profiling. That's the stop data. We'll talk about that a little bit more as it relates to profiling and regarding persons, pedestrians, or traffic stops, but also the Brady protocol regarding misconduct and the reporting of that to the district attorney's office. All those become important because they all become a part of that statewide mandate data system that's being developed right now that we talked about that just got passed. So again, 5.05, the bias crime, bias incident, that is an updated general order, but in there, there's reporting requirements for those. And so I'm going to very quickly transition this a little bit now to Lieutenant Tro. I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit more about the mandates that we have as it relates to reporting requirements, stop data, and we'll go from there.
You have me the mic over here. Just all right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of use of force reporting and accountability and some of our mandates and requirements that we have. So any use of force incident with one of our officers to a citizen, a suspect. So all the officers involved are required to write a report. And this is in our policies also. So all the officers have to write a report. All the witnesses are interviewed. If a supervisor's on scene, they also interview witnesses. The supervisor reviews and completes a use of force incident report. So he reviews all the reports, completes a separate use of force incident report. Those in turn all go to command staff. We're an accredited agency, and one of the requirements is that we review all use of force incidents as a command staff. So we review it, make sure it's within policy, and we actually write a summary about each use of force incident. And then we do a yearly report on that. And so the biggest thing is, our battery is running low. So Jose is going to plug in our computer. And then also on use of force, so there's some state requirements. Any deadly physical force against someone is reported and submitted to DOJ, Oregon DOJ. There's also some federal use of force requirements. Anytime there's a death of a person due to an officer's use of force, or a serious bodily injury, or a discharge of a firearm towards a person, there's also those reports that have to go to the FBI. So that's, any questions on anything on use of force with our officers and reporting? Good. Couple other things on, so there's also some, like Chief said, on profiling. So ORS 131-920, we have to have certain, this came out a few years ago now, policies and procedures prohibiting profiling. So we have to have a procedure, it's in our policy, of any complaint that comes in regarding the profiling, it's investigated thoroughly, and we have to submit the complaint to Law Enforcement Contact Policy and Data Review Committee for their review. So any complaint on profiling from any citizen, we do a full report investigation and send that in.
And on that one, just real quick, that's reviewed, and you have a second set of eyes looking at it from a different agency, looking at it to see whether or not we approached it correctly, we interviewed correctly, the timelines were done correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So that's done by a different agency who's collecting this data to make sure that the reporting requirements are done correctly.
The other thing is if our officer is involved in a death or serious injury to a suspect, back in 2007, Senate Bill 111 came out, which basically gives you guidelines on investigation of deadly use of force. And if we have that incident here in Canby, it's actually investigated by the interagency Clackamas County team, major crime team. So it consists of investigators from detectives from every agency in the county. So that way it's not us just investigating a use of force, a deadly force. It's actually, it's a team of people from outside agencies, and there's some requirements there. And again, we have to report those. That's what I got.
So there you go. So we do have a lot of mandated reporting. One of the things I'll have George continue to talk a little bit about is our stop data. We just got this like 2 days ago. And so it was timely. I tried to see if we can get it before our meeting today, and we have some preliminary data. It's not all there, but we have some preliminary data that we can share. And so Melissa, yeah.
Can you put up the statistical transparency of policing? Hopefully that comes up here. So I'll just start with it. So back in 2017, House Bill 2355 came out, which required law enforcement to report on all discretionary traffic and pedestrian stops, like Chief said earlier. So any stop that is made by an officer, traffic stop or a pedestrian stop. This is not calls for service where an officer gets called to, but a self-initiated activity by the officer. So there were some requirements of reporting some things in that. We were supposed to start, we were in tier 2 with our size of the department, which was supposed to start in July 1st of 2019. We actually started about 7 months earlier than the mandate to get our officers used to reporting. So we just got the information, like the Chief said, for the last year. So basically from July 1st to 2019 to the end of June 2020. So as you can see in these, so altogether in that year, we had 2,379 self-initiated stops by officers. So when they do a stop, they have to report at the end of the stop, they have to report some things. Some of the things is the total number of stops, race and gender of the person stopped, the reason for the stop disposition, and the searches. So you can see, so out of all those stops, they broke it down to the race, and you can look at those percentages, and then the gender, And then from those stops, what was the percentage of arrests and the arrests on those specific races? And then to the right, bottom right is the total searches. So you can see our percentages are really close to actually our population of what Canby has. Any questions on those?
And these are numbers that were supplied and calculated by DOJ or the
Criminal Justice Commission.
Criminal Justice
So they
Commission.
get, we don't see this, they get the data, you know, and at the end of the year, they gave us these numbers.
So there we go on that. So I'll talk real quick here. I'll let Lieutenant Jose Gonzalez talk to you a little bit about our IAs and some of the process there for documentation as well. See the microphone there?
Hello, everyone. So one of my roles here or assignments is to do all the internal affairs investigations. And that comes as complaints coming from citizens. It can be as simple as what I call a service complaint, is when a citizen is upset because that person got stopped and they thought the officer was rude and calls over here and makes a complaint. All those complaints, I review it, I investigated it. And if it's a service complaint, I think it's a minor complaint, I may assign that to a sergeant so they can investigate that with an officer. And my role is to contact the citizen either by a letter or over the phone or both and tell them the resolution about their complaint. I do that on a regular basis. My communication with the citizens and make the complaint. Oftentimes I send a registered letter, a regular letter in the mail, and sometimes emails and a phone call. And after that is done, I tend to 2 weeks later, I make a phone call to follow up with the citizens if anything else we could have done better. So we can learn to serve the citizens when they make a complaint. Part of my role too is every time with any of the policies that we have is the office of violated policy. Obviously, as the management here, we're going to review everything, and I will review that in case it needs to be an internal affair investigation possible for a violation of policy, and trying to find remedies for that officer so that won't happen again in the future. All our complaints are logged and are dated by month, date, and year. And every documentation is done on it is filed. So if we have a third-party audit, for instance, they can coming in to the PD and review that, and all the investigation will be there for those individuals to review if it comes to an audit. The other thing that the person contact is with the DA's office is about the Brady Protocol. The Brady Protocol is basically we have to provide, or the prosecutor has to provide all the information that is discoverable so that defendant can have any exculpatory information they can be in best for that defense of that defendant. So my job is in case of, let's say an officer had a complaint on a bias complaint or something that I investigated that it could have been possibly perceived as bias. My job here is to notify the DA's office immediately about that complaint so they can have that information in case that officer has to testify that something that could be seen as bias, so that the DA's office can basically utilize that information to see if they can use that officer as a witness. And that's something that they review it themselves, and we receive training on that, and we constantly improving on that since this protocol got in place. The other thing is the Brady Protocol, the part that is important, even the policies that we have, it requires the officer, let's say they see something that another officer did, let's say an use of force, to report that. It's mandatory. It's part of that Brady Protocol. So we have different areas where the officers are mandated, if anything were to be done by another officer inappropriately, that they need to report, mandated to report it. And that's about it. Any questions on that?
Okay.
So just one more thing. Just the FBI reporting the FBI for use of force, that's something we do voluntarily. We're not required to do it. We're ahead of the game in most of the agencies in the states. We just want to be proactive, and that's something we do on a monthly basis. I'm the person that is responsible to do that reporting every month that is required, and it's something we do voluntarily, and we're ahead of the game among many agencies in the state.
So just as a recap on that, you know, as far as the our policies as it reflects the hashtag #8can'twait, we basically have addressed or complied with just about everything on there. The ones we would not have maybe complied with in the sense, but we've addressed them would be, for an example, they ban shooting at a moving vehicle or from. We use that as a deadly force exception. And the reason we do that is we're trying to train our officers to be aware there are circumstances that exist out there where we just had a recent incident in Bothell, Washington, where two officers were trying to stop a car. The guy got out of the car, the suspect began firing at the officers. The driver of that car, the officer, was killed. The passenger was wounded. The car was still moving and rolled forward, eventually rolled and stopped in front of a tree or crashed into a tree. The wounded officer passenger was able to, at that time, fire some rounds. The suspect got away but was later caught. We're trying to teach our officers there are exceptions. There are times when you're going to have to be prepared, whether it's an ambush or try to respond when you can't get out of your car. But the standard is a deadly force standard, and you have to meet those requirements. You just cannot do it without some thought behind that and justification. And if you do, you're going to have to be responsible for that. But that would be an exception, for example. We believe that standard, to say you can never do it would be very detrimental to our officers. So that isn't our policy at this time, but we've addressed it. And we did talk about it, at least in that respect. We give warnings as soon as practical or if possible. If you're able to do it, we have that in our policy. You'll see that there. It's been highlighted. You'll see what the circumstances are in that regard. So I think a lot of them are met. The only one that hasn't been met, maybe as a recommendation, we're partway there, would be the body cameras. That would have been a part of the 75 things that white people can do for racial justice. But we started that way. We've moved in that direction. All of our patrol cars or uniform cars have cameras in them. We actively use them. There's an audible for that while they're operating that camera on a particular traffic stop. That's where the largest percentages of our stops or in incidences occur. We believe that body cameras have a role. There's no question about it. It's just a matter of the price, the tag, and the ongoing maintenance, its storage, and it's also editing issues that we have to look at that are requirements there that if we move further into that, we have to make a decision as a city whether that's the direction we're going to go. But we moved in that direction already, and we believe it is a tool. It's not an only tool, but it's a tool. I will tell you, in the 10 and a half years that I've been here, I've had 2 use of force complaints in those years. And I've had maybe about 4 or 5 disparate treatment complaints that we've looked at from an investigation standpoint, none of them which have been substantiated. So when we look at the body cameras and we look at how a lot of those are being used in the major cities as it relates to distrust to the police department, specifically as it relates to use of force, in those type of areas, we have not had those incidences, but we do capture a lot of that still on our vehicles. So it's a decision we have to make a decision down the road and decide if that's the direction we're going to go. We're not saying no at all. We've already moved that way, but it's a matter of just trying to move one step at a time. So with that, we can talk a little bit more about that if we need to, but I want to open it up for some questions. We talk fast, but we hope the material there is helpful as you've been able to follow. But again, there's a lot of things going on out there. We're not going to create a solution or have answers overnight, but we thought we'd get started because of all the conversations that are taking place. We want to let you know at least what our policies are, what are current, and what is in line with the new laws that are coming down. And again, this will be constantly changing. This will be an ongoing event probably for some time. And but that's where we are right now, and we thought this update would be helpful.
Chief Smith, thank you. Lieutenant, thank you. Appreciate the presentation and giving us a rundown on our policies and where we are at. It sounds like in most of these cases where we've been ahead of the curve on some of these things. So I appreciate the diligence there. Chief, on the first page there on the general order, it looks like you've got dates where this is often reviewed. Is this reviewed on an annual basis?
Go ahead. I'm going to let George talk about it because he's our accreditation manager, but we update our policies all the time. So if we have a legislative change, there's some kind of a DMV change or a search and seizure change that comes down, we're making those changes as they come down the pipe, but we have a review process, and I'll let George talk about that.
Yeah, so like Chief said, so any legislative changes or anything that comes down, case law or something, so we're constantly looking at those specific ones and we make changes that are appropriate. And then ones that we haven't, that hasn't come up, those are reviewed every 3 years. Every policy is reviewed to make sure that it is still good and everything is correct in it. But really the most changes are when changes in the law happen. Or case law happens. That's when we make the most changes.
And then we have an auditor come in who reviews those and determines if our policies are up to speed and lets us know if we're either in or out of compliance. And that's why the Oregon Accreditation Alliance that we've been a part of is an important piece, because it is another opportunity for someone else to look at our policies, who are current with the policies or the best practices out there to make recommendations if we miss something.
Yeah, and part of the accreditation is not only that you have the policy, but that you follow it. So there's over 100 standards. So basically, you have a policy on whatever it is, use of force. And so then not only do we have to say, hey, here's our policy for you to review, but here's some incidents that we had use of force that we're following the policy by reporting and so forth. So it's not just having the policy, it's making sure we have to show proof that we are following the policy.
And at least once a year, we bring a DOJ attorney to do what is called an in-service for all police officers. That way, if it's any change in the laws about use of force, he or she can come over here and tell the officers what the new law is, it changes. And if they have any questions about legal questions about that attorney, that the DOJ attorney from Oregon can tell them the route that they need to take. So we try to stay on top of that at least once a year, so everybody in the department is informed.
Thank you. My other question that I have is, where are we? We've looked at the policies currently, and then obviously with the legislature here in the short session, moving through a number of items pretty quickly. And I know that, and my understanding is there's probably more to come in the next short session. Where do we, as a police department, as a city, where are there areas where we may be falling short still?
Anywhere there could be a new policy change that may take some time to adapt to. For example, one of the ones that just passed that I mentioned earlier on the limitation of the arbitrator changing. Also, there is a requirement that needs to be met that there's a matrix as it relates to disciplinary practice. Well, they're trying to figure out how that might work. For example, is that, if you're going to have a matrix, we want it that's similar statewide. So what somebody's doing in Bend on the disciplinary issue is similar to somewhere else on, Astoria or Canby. So they're looking at a disciplinary matrix. So we don't have a disciplinary matrix. What we do is we base our discipline on past practice, based on what we've disciplined before, based on the severity of the complaint, and we keep consistent with that. But we would then be required to put a matrix together. So we would be short there. So we would have to put that together. But I think right now we're trying to decide, when I say we, the state, what that matrix looks like. So we would just need, that could be an area we're going to be weak on, and we would have to come up with a matrix of some type. If there's indecision on that, then we would probably look at trying to build a matrix based on our past practice here that we've done, so we can have some consistent standard that way with the union. But that might be an example where we would fall short on a law that comes down the pipe that makes a decision or recommendation, but we're not in a place yet to do it because we don't have a system in place.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Council questions, comments? Councilor Stern?
Mayor, thank you so much, Lieutenant Trout, Gonzalez, and Chief Smith. I think that this is really helpful for all of us, but I think also really helpful for our citizens who have been asking questions or just kind of wondering how our police department compares in policy to other ones. And I really appreciate all the work you put into this, and I'm really proud of the work that you've put into this. My question, and maybe you don't have the answer, but because it was not about a specific Canby policy, but when we were talking about Bill 4207, which addresses hiring, my question is, does that, because I know you just kind of did some highlights of it, does that address the circumstance of if an officer applied to, say, Canby PD, but they have in the past or are currently leaving a position during an active investigation?
They're not considering.
Which that, well, you know, we would, I think a short answer would be yes, because not only is there a duty now from that law enforcement agency where that person is to provide information, we have a requirement to ask for it. So we're going to learn about that ongoing investigation one way or another before that person's hired.
Okay, so because I know in the past there was a question of like if the investigation hadn't concluded, not just in general, not about Canby specifically, that police officers could leave because they're under investigation, get hired somewhere else, and then that investigation is never resolved. But it sounds like this kind of addresses that, right? That they would have to disclose.
It would be my understanding that's correct. And also DPSST has a requirement. There's a form that we fill out, every agency does, at the time of separation from that agency. And you have to mark a box in there. One of those boxes that are marked is the person left during the course of an investigation.
Okay.
So we could find that there as well as a potential source. But to answer your question about this particular law, I think the answer to your question, I think, is yes, based on my understanding of that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Chief.
And let me add something, Sarah. So I've been involved in the hiring processes probably for the last 15 years and the last 10 with Amanda. And any lateral candidate that applies here, if they make it to the interview process, the first question that is asked is if they're in good standing or if they are under investigation at their current department. If they are, we do not consider them at that time until the investigation is complete.
Great. Thank you, Lieutenant True.
Yep.
Any additional questions or comments here?
I know we have 18 more minutes, so please use our time.
Councilor Gale?
Hi, Chief. I know you and I have talked about it in the past and wondered if it's still the situation. Body cams, they can wind up in Oregon being a public record if they're, even if worn inside of a private residence. Is that the case?
Correct.
Yeah, and
there are many challenges to body cams. Like the chief said earlier, you know, we're not against them, and it is a tool. but they do have challenges. I mean, cost is just only one part of it. There's editing. It becomes a public record request. It's when to record. You know, some agencies that have it, they record on every single contact with a citizen. So if they're flagged over for directions, they turn it on, right, and tell them you have to, in Oregon, you have to tell them you're being recorded, unless it's an officer safety issue. But tell them they're being recorded and let them know, and then we have to keep that, in the server or cloud or whatever. There's some costs there, but there's definitely some privacy issues. If you go into a home, and I mean that's videotaped. I mean everything that camera sees in that house. So those are some concerns also. Any juvenile, if there's a public record request and we do release it, so the juveniles all have to be, blurred out. So there is some editing software that can be, they can do that, but it does take some time and effort to do those things.
Yeah, thank you. A daunting challenge. We can't just say, just turn them on.
Right.
Thank you.
Councilor Parker.
Well, Chief, I think I've told you before, a quote from my daddy that the absence of bad things happening takes a lot of work. I appreciate the fact that in the 10 years I've been on the council, there hasn't been a headline that says City Council pays out $660,000 to as a result of police action. So thank you for that. It sounds like you guys have your hands full with changes that are coming from the legislature, and if the two houses of U.S. Congress get their act together, there's possibility of some federal legislation, among which is a nationwide body cam, which would be funded. So while I am interested in carrying on the conversation of body cameras, and I recognize the fact that there are some cities in Oregon much smaller than we are that have them and manage to handle the issues there. But Chief, in the minute or two we've got left here, let me take you to the big picture here on the thing that has been on everyone's minds in the last 6 months when anyone talks about a local Oregon police force. Would any of these policies, any of these laws alone have prevented the abuse that we've been reading about for the past several months in West Lynn?
That's an easy answer for me because I have none to give you. I don't have the details. I don't have the information. I'm not a part of the investigation, understand all the stuff that happened there to even really begin to speculate what would have and what could have not have occurred. And we're just going to have to wait till that comes out. What I do know is, from my perspective here, hiring people with character and credibility who are trying to do the right things. We know they're going to have an aptitude or we wouldn't hire them. We're trying to find people that are trying to do the right things with the right motives, and then to try to have the correct and appropriate supervision and training that allows people to make good judgment and decisions as we go along is going to be one of the best things that helps us prevent those types of things from happening. Again, I can't speculate, and I don't know the answers what happened there. That information hasn't been released, and I wouldn't begin to even start down that road. So I can't help you on that question.
All right, well, I'll buy that for now. But next time we meet, I'm going to ask if the information's been released, because I do have a serious question with this. Is maybe you've heard some of the information that's been published by the Oregonian. And my question as a policymaker, I only have three roles, I think, in terms of police. In terms of budget, in terms of policy, and in terms of hiring a city administrator and any sort of direction we might give her or him. So at some point, I would like your advice, Chief, on what a city council can do to prevent abuses like that in a police force.
again, I'm more than happy to have the conversation. I try not to make a decision based on what's in the newspaper. We're just going to have to wait and see a little bit. But when we want to talk about building an ethical, credible police department, we certainly have a lot of information out there about what's right and what's working. And I think we're not perfect. I'm going to tell you that now. We're not perfect, but we're working in a direction that we're trying to have a connectivity with our community and trying to have best practices that represent the things that I think people, I'm hearing them say they want their police departments to be. And trying to work toward those goals and listening and being in tune with that is going to be very helpful. Now, other things that are important is proper supervision. And I've talked about this for years. We don't have supervision 24/7. That's a crucial part. And for all of our shifts. So having accountability, having leadership and mentorship in a way that brings people in line with the values of the organization, under that kind of appropriate supervision is a must. So I'll start with that, and I've talked about that for a long time. So we start with those types of things, and I think we know what those kinds of things are, and we continue moving in that direction. But certainly a conversation that we can have as a team as we work together to try to reach that goal.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. And Councilor Parker asking the question as well. Thank you. Councilor Berge.
I'd like to say I think you guys did an excellent presentation for us tonight. I'd like to thank you for that. I'd say that I'm impressed, but I'm extremely impressed every time I look at the leadership that you guys are providing. A lot of these bullet points that you guys went over tonight, you showed how you're ahead of the curve on that stuff. And for that, I'd like to thank you for your leadership and guiding from the top down. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Councilor Spoon, you were waving your hand earlier. Did you have another question?
Yeah, but it's really not a question. It's a question that can be asked in another forum because it's not specific to the materials that were presented. It was kind of a follow-up question about something else, and this probably isn't the best forum for it. So I'll follow up with Chief on my clarification question later.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Barwig, or anything from you at all? No? Okay.
Mayor, if we could, I'd like to acknowledge Melissa's work tonight. I think this may be the first time that we've done this type of presentation with all of us in separate locations, her in a different location, and the police, and being able to bring up on screen for us in real time that type of information. That is slick.
Thank you, Melissa, for your help on those displays too. Appreciate it.
Okay.
I can't hear you, Brian. Is
I
it
know.
me again?
I got messed up with the mute and unmute button. Chief, lieutenants, thank you very much for your presentation. Again, appreciate your leadership, and to Councilor Parker's comment about the last 10 years, Chief, I think when you came in, you brought in a new wave of a culture and an influence and leadership that definitely tightened up some things. And I think, you know, with the officers that we have, and I appreciate where we are as a police department and what we're doing and staying ahead of these pieces and looking at our policies. So thank you for that. If there's nothing else, we're going to take I'll adjourn the work session. I noticed that we had 2 guests joining us. Appreciate you being here. Hopefully you'll tune in. If you have questions, please feel free to tune into the city council meeting and bring those questions forward, and we'll see what we can do about answering those. With that, we'll take a brief break and convene the city council meeting here at 7 o'clock. Thank you all.
Good night.